Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with a 1899 Victorian Gothic romance titled The Light of Scarthey by English author Egerton Castle. Now, Egerton Castle certainly sounds like it would be a pseudonym or a pen name, but a little bit of research informed me that it was not. It was actually the name of an actual author. He wrote several novels, not only on his own, but also with his wife, Agnes Egerton. And Egerton Castle was not only an author, but he was also an antiquarian. He was a book collector. He was an expert on book plates, and he was an early practitioner of historical fencing. And he actually represented the British Olympic team. He was the captain of that Olympic team at the 1908 Olympics for their saber team. And so it sounds like he had quite an interesting life, which certainly suited him to being the writer of historical romances. So The Light of Scarthey is set around the years 1814 and 1815, but there are flashbacks and callbacks to an earlier time during the Napoleonic Wars. And so our main character is Adrian Lansdale, often referred to throughout the novel as Sir Adrian, because he is in fact the heir to a large estate and a fortune. But after a tragic romance in his younger days, in his early 20s, he has secluded himself in a lighthouse on an island just off the edge of his estate. And he spends his days there with his French servant Renee and a single maid and housekeeper. And he spends his days there reading and studying and just generally being in solitude. That is until one day a distant family member of his, Molly, who is quite a young woman at this point, shows up on the shores of the lighthouse, seeking shelter after being caught in a storm. And he is completely in awe and shocked because Molly resembles her mother, Cecile, who Adrian had a fated love affair with 20 years earlier. And Adrian had met Cecile at his family home. She was a distant cousin and had followed her back to France. Cecile's husband had died protecting the crown in France, and Cecile was determined to go back and fight for the royalist cause. And Adrian escorted her back, was deeply in love with her, and she died, leaving him heartbroken in his early 20s. And it's not until years later, at the start of this novel, that he begins to come out of that seclusion by meeting Cecile's daughter, Molly, and suddenly falling in love with Molly as the almost exact image of the mother. Now, this in itself is an ill-fated romance as seen throughout the novel. And they're not exactly tailor-made for each other either, and there are certainly problems that are going to arise when you're more in love with the image of the mother than with the woman you've married. In fact, on his wedding day, Molly is very happy to be married. She is ecstatic. And then Adrian looks at her and just says, Cecile's daughter, what have I done?" or something to that effect. And she is immediately a little bit cold to her husband and realizes that perhaps she's made a mistake. And we see throughout the novel the story told first from Adrian's perspective and then from Molly's perspective, and in some portions of the novel from the perspective of the journal that she keeps. Now, given that this is a romance, it doesn't end there. Rather, Molly begins to seek love elsewhere and becomes infatuated with the suitor, the lover of her sister Madeline. And Madeline is blonde. She's considered the prettier of the two sisters. And although Molly is more like her mother and is a brunette and is quite pretty as well, Madeline is really the one that much of the family puts their hopes in. And Adrian is at a disadvantage or an odd position in most of the novel because after the death of Cecile, he had been lost at sea essentially and forced into hard labor, forced into servitude, and was gone for nearly 10 years with his entire family thinking he's dead. And so naturally, his younger brother took over the family estate, took over the family title, and sort of assumed that, everything was his. He married, he took over the family estate, he was managing the financial affairs, and then suddenly his brother Adrian comes back from the dead. And he doesn't quite want to give that up, but is willing to until Adrian says, that's ridiculous. I love Cecile. I will never marry. I'm going to seclude myself on this island. And his younger brother gets increasingly comfortable with the idea of running this estate, of having access to those funds, of, although not having the title, being the Lord of the Manor in everything but title. And so he's quite hostile to the idea that his brother would suddenly marry Molly. And so you have this great setting, this lighthouse, these stormy coasts, these rocks where people nearly die and do die, this seafaring setting, and then of course this grand manor house, which is the Lansdale family home. So it's very Gothic in that sense, and you certainly do have the romantic elements. But it also comes across in some ways as a bit of an adventure story because you have Captain Jack, who is a friend of Adrian's, who often stops off at this lighthouse and who also falls in love and finds himself in a dangerous predicament. And it's just this delightful combination of all these adventurous and romantic elements, and it's very readable. I think although this is a relatively unknown novel, it really holds up as both a historical romance, as a historical novel, and as just something that's fun and exciting to read. The language isn't difficult, the language isn't bad. In fact, it's quite engaging, and it's something that I would highly recommend if you're interested in historical or Gothic romances, particularly from the late Victorian era.